Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. And I am seeing you once again with lecture 12 of modern novel, that is novel 2. What we are going to do in today's talk, we are going to cover a critical discourse analysis based on the novel To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. We will try to explore some important lines in the novel, and we will see how we can interpret them. And I'll probably give you this tip once again to understand how can you take these lines, can interpret them, can understand them to enrich your understanding, and can use them in different answers to substantiate your viewpoints. Then we will discuss a critique on the novel To the Lighthouse, and we will finish today's talk and this novel with a comparison between James Joyce and Virginia Woolf's writing and their perspectives. So let's begin with today's talk that makes us look at different symbols used in the story. And this makes us ask that what are some of the main symbols in To the Lighthouse and what do they signify? We understand very well that use of symbols, motifs and themes are basically to neatly knit a plot structure of the story, and they always add into the meanings they are basically meaning making devices used by the writers. So how does Woolf's use of symbolism advance her thematic goals? So after reading the novel, probably you would have understand what are the thematic objectives behind the story, and what are the thematic objectives of Virginia Woolf in plotting the story. So how does she use such devices like symbols, motifs and themes in order to enhance the effect of her objectives? So the different symbols used in the story will give you an idea how they are incorporated in, and what if they would have not been incorporated, what gap the absence would create. James gives us a clue as to how to interpret symbols into the lighthouse, and that's a big job that she has done. As he finally draws the Ramsay's boat up to the lighthouse, he considers two competing and seemingly contradictory meanings of the lighthouse. The first depends upon the lighthouse as it appeared to him as a child. Then it was a silvery, mist-colored tower, and seemed to suggest the vague, romantic quality of the past. So you see that the very symbol of lighthouse can be interpreted in altogether different perspectives to understand opposing ideas. At one point you will find a lighthouse being considered as contradictory object presented in the story that stands opposing the dark of life, because it's the one it's torch bearing element in the middle of the sea, and most of the time you will see that focus on the lighthouse is at the night time in the dark, when the residents of the Ramsay's house could see lighthouse from by sitting inside home. So mostly the lighthouse is focused in the story during the night time, during the dark. So here it stands as a clear contrast between light and dark. Now light and dark can be interpreted in different ways. It can be interpreted as beauty and ugliness. It can be interpreted as good and bad. It can be interpreted as something you want and something unwanted. Like you will see that most of the people at Ramsay's house, except Mr. Ramsay, and particularly the little boy, he has very strong longing to reach lighthouse, to grab it, to be there. However, Mr. Ramsay, being another personality, an entirely different personality, who in fact stands opposing his family, does not want it. So what kind of interpretation you give to it, that is your perspective. But this is one kind of meaning can be produced. Secondly, you can see that it was a silvery, mist-colored tower and seemed to suggest the vague romantic quality of the past. Here, lighthouse here stands as a vague memory of the past, because in past, when you think about your past, you cannot, after some time, you cannot recall all the details regarding your past, and the minute details somewhere skip in the details. What you get to remember, or what you are able to recall, are the highlights, are the things which are most prominent in your memory. And here, lighthouse is symbolizing the memories of past. The second meaning stands in opposition, for as James nears the lighthouse and sees its barred windows and laundry drying on the rock, there is nothing romantic about it. He resolves, however, to honor the truth of both images, deciding that nothing is simply one thing. There are different angles of everything, every object and every aspect. Like James' interpretation of the lighthouse, the dominant symbols in the novel demand open readings. Mrs. Ramsay, wrapping her shawl around the boar's head, can be read merely as protection of her impressionable children from the unsightly suggestion of death. But it can also be read as a selfish attempt to keep from them a profound and inescapable truth. Choosing one option or the other diminishes the complexity of the novel's symbols and characters. Woolf resists formulaic symbols whereby one entity straightforwardly stands for another. She thus places us in the same position as her characters, and that's the quality Woolf is identified for. The world of the novel is not filled with solidly or surely determined truths. Rather, truth, as Lily points out, must be collected from an endless number of impressions. She wishes that she had more than 50 pairs of eyes with which to view Mrs. Ramsay and understand her. Again, this point of view reinforces the previous note that there is no single angle to any phenomenon, whether it's an object or an aspect or a point of view or a person or a character or a situation. Nothing can be viewed from one angle and can be taken as a single truth. There are several truths in reality, and they all stand strong side by side. We must approach the symbolism to the lighthouse with the same patience for multiple meanings, and that makes us produce multiple interpretations, multiple understandings and multiple meanings, because we all thinking brains, we all have our own aspects to back our interpretations. We all have our own viewpoints substantiated by our own models of thinking, and nothing can be claimed as wrong. Another question that would demand your attention is that if To the Lighthouse is a novel about the search for meaning in life, how do the characters conduct their search? Are they successful in finding an answer? And when we think about the characters who are presented as the searchers of meaning in life, we see Lily and Mrs. Ramsay to be the prime characters. So how can you tackle this question? That by thinking on different lines, and here I give you some suggestions, that although all the characters engage themselves in the same quest for meaningful experience, the three main characters have vastly different approaches. Now, which are these three characters? As I discussed, Mrs. Ramsay, Lily, and Mr. Ramsay too, because most of the time you will find this character as a sharp contrast to Mrs. Ramsay's character, and that helps us understand Mrs. Ramsay's character in more details. Mr. Ramsay's search is intellectual. He hopes to understand the world and his place in it by working at philosophy and reading books. However, how intellectual is that? And is it intellectual or apparently intellectual? You need to look into the facts. Mrs. Ramsay conducts her search through intuition rather than intellect. We know that Mrs. Ramsay is not an educated lady. However, she makes a lot of sense when she talks, and her thoughts, her words, as well as her actions are full of sense and wisdom. She relies on social traditions such as marriage and dinner parties to structure her experience. Well, this is her way of learning, this is her way of performing, and this is her stage of performing. Lily, on the other hand, tries to create meaning in her life through her paintings. That's her way of catharsis. She seeks to unify disparate elements in a harmonious whole, and she tries to produce meaning in her own way by combining and fitting things in her own canvas, following her own free will. Moreover, you will also see that while these characters experience varying degrees of success in their quest for meaning, none arrives at a revelation that fulfills the search, or that can be stamped as the final truth or the absolute truth. As an old man, Mr. Ramsay continues to be as tortured by the spectre of his own mortality as he is in youth. Mrs. Ramsay achieves moments in which life seems filled with meaning, but as her dinner party makes clear, they are terribly short-lived. Lily too manages to wrest a moment from life and lend to it meaning and order. Her paintings basically is a small testament to that struggle. But as she reflects while pondering the meaning of her life, there are no great revelations, but only little daily miracles that one, if lucky, can fish out of the dark. So this was all about different perspectives and main characters relating to meaning of search in the story. Another question, thought-provoking question, can be comparing and contrasting Mrs. and Mr. Ramsay to understand these characters, and basically to understand the difference of these characters, and why the writer would use such a sharp contrast. What are those qualities which are to be understood, and which writer is bringing in front, in the limelight, by providing such a sharp contrast? How are they alike and how are they different? This is the point that we need to understand. When we are talking about their differences and similarities, we are basically picking out those things which writer would want our attention on. So, how can you tackle this question? By providing different angles of search in comparing and contrasting these characters. You will see that although Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay's love for each other and for their children is beyond doubt, like all parents, their approaches to life could not be more opposite. They are totally opposite in their approach towards life. And you see that the point being made here is their approach towards life, and this point can be catered by looking at different aspects, and their love for their family, their love for their children is one aspect of this point. So if you want to add more ideas into substantiating this point that they have different approach towards life, you are basically adding weightage into your point of view. Then you will see that Mrs. Ramsay is loving, kind to her children, selfless and generously giving, while Mr. Ramsay is cold and socially awkward. If you are trying to assess them as social beings, what kind of social relations do they keep? You can see that Mrs. Ramsay is kind of loving person and caring, and you will find her knitting socks and sweaters for kids living in the lighthouse. However, you will find Mr. Ramsay threatening her to stop doing this and stop being sympathetic to poor. So this will give you another idea, another angle of the same picture, which again helps you substantiate that they keep different approaches. He is stern with his children, which causes them to hate and fear him, and he displays a neediness that makes him rather pathetic in the eyes of his guest. Again, when you are trying to understand his social position, you can here not only include his behavior with his own family. In fact, within comparison, you are keeping another comparison when you are looking at this character with his family, with his guest, and with society. You can have a comparison and can eventually find out that he is as pathetic with his family as in all other domains. So particularly you will find his character quite a rude character with the scholar who is residing at his place in order to get his guidance. So now, despite these profound differences, however, you will see that Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay share the knowledge that all things from human life to human happiness are destined to end. So it is from this shared knowledge that their greatest differences grow. Keenly aware of human mortality, Mrs. Ramsay is fueled to cultivate moments that soothe her consciousness, while Mr. Ramsay nearly collapses under the weight of this realization. Now, let's understand the theme of stream of consciousness and the technique of stream of consciousness. That's a big contribution of Virginia Woolf to the English literature. The first utterance when we say the term of modernism, we remind of Virginia Woolf with her original use of the stream of consciousness in her works. Although we have already discussed it while discussing themes, but now we are giving it a final word as to how this technique is considered as a big contribution by the writer. If consciousness is related to the mind of a person, then what makes it so important to be used as the self-consciousness? The self-consciousness resembles a river or waterfall to represent the flow of thoughts and opinions that are hidden in your own mind. So we all have our secret opinions that nobody knows in a way that every human being has the same characteristic feature in terms of pondering from their mind and getting to know only this person. Virginia Woolf in this point has a huge contribution to reflect the nature of human effectively, and she is the English writer who is the pioneer in this field and who presents them stream of consciousness writing as its pursuit. So if a question comes about the technique of the beginning of or the nature of stream of consciousness technique introduced, or I would say extended by Virginia Woolf, you can probably add these points over there too, and it is not to mention that this can enrich your description regarding the theme when you are discussing it. But among the stream of consciousness novelists in England, Virginia Woolf is the most important name. You will find many other novelists who would do the same, like as of James Joyce, but you will find her name being articulated most of the time to be the most important writer of the technique. In fact, she realized that it is not enough to express only outside reality, but regarding as the use of one technique. She found limited and restricted to use only the conventions and traditions of writing style. Hence, she created the concept of the stream of consciousness to satisfy her own urge of exploring different angles of looking at one thing, to reveal the inner sides of personality with experimental forms in her novel. Woolf shows not only the mirror of reality integrating with the society, but also the picture of people's mind. We easily see the most striking examples of how Woolf portrayed the concept of the stream of consciousness, every detail in her great novels like Mrs. Dalloway or To the Lighthouse. These are two most important novels to understand the use of and the wonders of technique, the stream of consciousness. There is definitely some form or pattern and some inner unity in these novels. Of course, the influence of Joyce and Bergson is also considerable. So among all these writers who would use this technique quite often, again you will find Virginia Woolf being articulated, her name being articulated most of the time. And that is that her essential method is her own. She has some uniqueness in the use of this technique. That is why we find that the novelist is playing the role of his central intelligence in her outstanding novels and is constantly busy organizing the material and illuminating it by her own comments. And you will find her present in her own novel. In fact, Virginia Woolf was a great experimenter. She was an innovator and creator. She experimented with many methods and gave to the stream of consciousness technique turns and twists, and finally achieved her complete success in Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse. These novels in fact can be called her masterpieces. Virginia Woolf has entrusted in both the inner and outer life simultaneously, and probably this vision has come out of her philosophy, where she says that nothing is absolutely true. There can't be absolute truth, and there are multiple truths. So, however, as we know from her stories, Woolf is more interested in the inner than the outer life of a character, and this can be called as a influence of the time, because psychology and psychoanalysis was one influence of 20th century's literary works. Now, how do we understand this, the inner and outer life? The main point that Woolf wanted to show us is to demonstrate the soul or psyche truthfully and realistically by using the stream of consciousness technique. Instead of truthfully, I will say more realistically, because again, if I say truthfully, even she can't encircle the totality of truth. She wants to provide a message to us in that the human psyche is not a simple entity functioning logically and rationally. No matter if logic and rationale is there, there's a lot beyond logic and rationale that goes in between when a character is acting or thinking or doing or involved in any kind of activity. That's why there is the interior monologue and there are the fluid mental states. But we get the interior monologue and the fluid mental states existing simultaneously at a number of points in a person's total experience. Another point is that Woolf had an impact on interior monologue, which is the consequences of the stream of consciousness. In a novel, the interior monologue is in fact a fundamental part of the novels in a new literary genre, which is referred to the use of self of consciousness. This internal side or interior monologue is the silent speech flowing from the mind of a given character and introduces us directly into the internal life of the character without the author's adding his or her own perspectives. That's brilliant. So briefly, it is an expression of the most deep, intimate thoughts which represent outside reality, allowing the main character to analyze in her mind and reflect his or her impression by adding these standpoints. Therefore, we may say that this is a substantial technical device owing to the effect of the stream of consciousness that enables the reader to enter the inner life of a character straight away and to pay attention the flow of sensations and lines of vision without depending on the rules of societies. This can basically cause the appearance of individuality or the self-realization as the result of the stream of consciousness. So Virginia Woolf broke away the rules of general type of chronological of narration that attributes to the new shape of a genre. There is no set descriptions of characters, no set rules, no set flows or chronological moves as in the older novel or traditional writings. There is a shift from the externals to the inner self of the personality, and that is too quick, too unexpected, and too beyond any set pattern that it just moves the mind and thoughts and hearts of reader, and eventually brings immense pleasure and let the audience get involved in what they are reading. Moreover, the stream of consciousness takes away its direction in the sense of a logical arrangement of incidents and events, leading chronologically to survive in society and the development of the character according to the norms of society, to the attraction of the character from his or her own mind. Because Virginia Woolf supports the idea of subjectivity in her novels in connection with no plot, no character, no tragedy, no comedy, and no love interest, as in the traditional novel. That is why she abandoned the convention of story for the same reason. So she is writer of her free will and free choice. So what happens that Woolf uses a stream of consciousness technique in order to put the thoughts that pass from the character's mind, their feelings, reactions and memories throughout the events of the day, throughout what happens to them. And that's quite not only quite interesting, but it takes you closer to the character. You're not only given the selected frames of a character's life to understand as much only. It's like writer is controlling and letting you understand only what he wants to understand. However, bringing you from these different channels is to letting different windows open to invite you for your understanding and interpretation. So the novel does not follow a linear plot line. You may find it a little difficult while reading in understanding and making connections, and where you will find Virginia Woolf is speaking, where the character is speaking, where the character is in the present or where the character is in the past, and when the character is having flashbacks and when is the reality or the present time. If you notice that the self of consciousness is always related to the events which are connected with memories from the character's past or the reality that the main character of the story face. So it's between a sudden shift and switch between past and present. And again it takes us to that philosophy that nothing is past. it's a kind of flow between time. You are moving between time. Nothing is an absolute past. Woolf shows the characters' internal realities with their external reality in order to resemble the way in which we experience life. That's because we see common qualities as the same on human nature in Woolf's every work, so as to come people's mind together. And then you will find this idea of isolation, and how do we track and how do we identify this feeling and this, I would say, this characteristics of Virginia's Woolf characters in her writing. When we look at the biography of Virginia Woolf in her personal life, Woolf has the alienation, isolated lifestyle in the sense of evaluating her life from her own mind. You definitely would have, in the very first few lectures based on this novel, we discussed her life, her biography, and I also provided you with some of the video clips which I hope and I'm positive that definitely would have enriched your understanding. You will find her life a kind of life that helped her isolating herself. The circumstances she went through were kind of circumstances which would take somebody away from society and social gatherings. So how can we understand that Woolf can influence from the self of consciousness? That's a question that I'm asking you. Well, she was not satisfied with the real life which gives a stable, limited description, and saw the life is meaningless as it appears in front of our eyes, looking at the reality and obeying the norms of society. So, what is the meaning of life for Woolf? A simple question that has been answered in various ways in her writings. One that tended to close in on one with years. The great revelation had never come. The great revelation perhaps never did come. Instead, there were little daily miracles, illuminations, matches struck unexpectedly in the dark. So, in her work called To the Lighthouse, she criticizes the society from adapting the self of consciousness. Even her another work named Mrs. Dalloway, she used this technique excellently by putting herself inside of the main character. So, the stream of consciousness, the discussion about the stream of consciousness, the element of isolation and the meaning-making aspect of the technique, it specifies what a person thinks about something and how she aggregates their vision and the ability of commenting by using the observable facts, as you would find Virginia Woolf doing that quite effectively. Woolf supports this idea by saying that it is insufficient, unsatisfactory, and unconvincing for the readers to illuminate them when a modernist text is explained by only external reality. So to Virginia, to Woolf's, basically taking care of only external reality is not conveying a modern approach towards writing. So after discussing the stream of consciousness and few critical questions, we are going to talk about a few important lines in the story that needs and demand some explanation, and this way you will learn how to understand explaining and how to learn, you will learn how to explain different lines and interpret them and use them for your own purpose. You will find these lines in chapter 6 or 4 maybe. Who shall blame him? Who will not secretly rejoice when the hero puts his armor off and halts by the window and gazes at his wife and son, who very distant at first gradually come closer and closer, till lips and book and heard are clearly before him, though still lovely and unfamiliar from the intensity of his isolation, and the waste of ages, and the perishing of the stars, and finally putting his pipe in his pocket and bending his magnificent head before her, who will blame him if he does homage to the beauty of the world? Can you see this? I would call it a paragraph of almost 9 sentences, could have been 9 sentences, however it's single sentence, and in fact a question, an interrogative kind of statement. Well, here you are. In this chapter, as Mr. Ramsay strolls across the lawn, the window, he catches sight of Mrs. Ramsay and James in the window. His reaction comes as something of a surprise given the troubled ruminations of his mind described just pages before. He, like nearly every character in the novel, is keenly aware of the inevitability of death and the likelihood of its casting his existence into absolute oblivion. Mr. Ramsay knows that few men achieve intellectual immortality, and that is basically what he's running after. The above passage that I discussed testifies to his knowledge that all things, from the stars in the sky to the fruits of his career, are doomed to perish. Here, rather than cave into the anxieties brought on by that knowledge, punish James for dreaming of the lighthouse, or demand that Mrs. Ramsay or Lily lavish him with sympathy, Mr. Ramsay satisfies himself by appreciating the beauty that surrounds him. The tableau of his wife and child cannot last after all. They will eventually move and break the pose, but it has the power, nevertheless, to assuage his troubled mind. These moments integrate the random fragments of experience and interaction in the world, as Mr. Ramsay brings his wife and son visually closer and closer, and the distance among the three shortens, buoying Mr. Ramsay up from the depths of despair. Second line that I would like to discuss with you is that, could loving, as people called it, make her and Mrs. Ramsay one? For it was not knowledge but unity that she desired, not inscriptions on tablets, nothing that could be written in any language known to men, but intimacy itself, which is knowledge, she had thought, leaning her head on Mrs. Ramsay's knee. Now these lines come from Lily in chapter 8 of The Window, as she and William Banks stand on the lawn watching the Ramsays. Banks criticizes Mr. Ramsay for his hypocrisy in being narrow-minded, and Lily is about to respond with a criticism of Mrs. Ramsay when she notices the look of rapture on Banks' face. She realizes that he loves Mrs. Ramsay, and she feels that this mention is a contribution to the good of humanity. Overwhelmed with love herself, Lily approaches Mrs. Ramsay and sits beside her. Her thoughts here are noteworthy because they point to the distinction between ways of acquiring knowledge. Instinct on the one hand and intelligence on the other. Mrs. Ramsay knows what she does of the world by the former method, while Mr. Ramsay depends upon inscriptions on tablets. Here, as she wonders how one person comes to truly know another, Lily straddles the line that separates emotions from intellect, and that separates Mrs. Ramsay from her husband. This position anticipates Lily's role at the end of the novel when she stands watching Mr. Ramsay's boat and indulges in powerful remembrance of Mrs. Ramsay. At that moment, Lily arrives at her elusive vision, completes her painting, and achieves the unity she craves in the previous lines. And then another important moment from the novel, it partook of eternity. There is a coherence in things, a stability, something she meant is immune from change, and shines out. She glanced at the window with its ripple of reflected lights, in the face of the flowing, the fleeting, the spectral like a ruby, so that again tonight she had the feeling she had had once today, already, of peace, of rest. Of such moments, she thought, the thing is made that endures. Well, who can be this? Again, the window is in many respects the heart of the novel. These lines are heart of the novel. In Mrs. Ramsay's dinner party, we see the rhythmic movement from chaos to order, from obscurity to clarity of vision, through which the novel progresses. The dinner party begins to Mrs. Ramsay's mind as something of a disaster. Not all of the guests have arrived. Paul and Minta, for instance, have yet to return from the beach with Andrew and Nancy. Charles Tansley makes hostile comments to Lily. Augustus Carmichael offends his host by asking for a second plate of soup. Soon enough, however, as darkness descends outside and the candles are lit, the evening rights itself. Everyone is content as Mrs. Ramsay intends, and everyone will remember the evening as beautiful and right. This passage describes these rare, priceless moments which take on a kind of psychological preeminence. The guests will remember this evening and will experience with inexplorable nostalgia, peace and rest. In a world in which struggle and destruction are inevitable, the possibility for such domestic respite provides great comfort. And in these lines, she could not say it. As she looked at him, she began to smile. For though she had not said a word, he knew, of course he knew, but she loved him. He could not deny it. And smiling, she looked out of the window and sat thinking to herself, nothing on earth can equal this happiness. Yes, you are right, it's going to be wet tomorrow. You won't be able to go. And she looked at him smiling, for she had triumphed again. She had not said it, yet he knew. This passage, taken from chapter 12 of The Window, is a lyrical demonstration of how disjointed people and their fragmented emotions can come together. Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay represent opposite approaches to life, as you would have definitely observed and understood it by now. Possessed of a stolidly rational and scientific mind, Mr. Ramsay relies on what can be studied, proven and spoken. Hence, at the end of The Window, he wants to hear Mrs. Ramsay declare her love for him, to be said, to be articulated, to be conveyed. However, Mrs. Ramsay navigates life on a less predictable course, and she does not articulate it. She is led by her emotions rather than her mind, and led by her feelings rather than her logics. This approach provides her a greater range and freedom of expression. For instance, she can express her affection for her guest by orchestrating a lovely and memorable evening rather than forcing herself to articulate, or, like Mr. Ramsay, punish herself for not being able to articulate these feelings. In Woolf's estimation, these traits are gender specific. So beautifully put up. She argues that Men are most often satisfied by direct declarations, as when in the novel's final pages James is mollified only by his father's praise of his sailing skills. So how gender's attributes are separated and conveyed. Women, on the other hand, often convey their meaning by what they choose not to say. Like Mrs. Ramsay in her triumph, at the end of the window, Lily is able to convey her sympathy for Mr. Ramsay without pronouncing it. She lets him tie her shoes. Alright, so in fifth important quote, we hear that the lighthouse was then a silvery, misty-looking tower with a yellow eye that opened suddenly and softly in the evening. Now, James looked at the lighthouse. He could see the whitewashed rocks, the tower stark and straight. He could see that it was bared with black and white. He could see windows in it. He could even see washing spread on the rocks to dry. So that was the lighthouse, was it? No, the other was also the lighthouse, for nothing was simply one thing. The other lighthouse was true too. Which lighthouse? Now, readers are left perplexed and thinking, what was the other lighthouse? So as the Ramsay's boat approaches the lighthouse, in this chapter, the lighthouse, James reflects on images of the edifice that are competing in his mind. The first is from his childhood, when the lighthouse, seen from a distance, was a silvery, misty-looking tower. The second image, formed as he sails closer, is striped of its shadows and romance. So the structure appears hard, plain, and real. Its bared windows and the laundry drying on the rocks present nothing magical or romantic. James' first inclination is to banish one of these pictures from his mind and grant the other sovereignty, but he corrected himself, realizing that the lighthouse is both what it was then and what it is now. That was the reality of his childhood, and that is the reality of his adult age. The task that James faces is a reconciliation of these competing images into a whole truth. This challenge is the same one that Lily faces at the end of the novel, for she must reconcile her romantic vision of and disappointment with Mrs. Ramsay. To do so and to admit the complex, even contradictory nature of all things, the novel suggests is to possess a greater and more artful understanding of life. So this was about the important lines in the story that were interpreted, and I made it understandable for you. How can you have different interpretations of the same lines, however considering its two angles? Now we are going to talk about a critique written on the story. And it is said that the lighthouse stands in the distance. It signifies a far-off place that takes planning and work to reach. And that can be taken allegorically, that can be taken symbolically, that can be taken as an interpretation too. Depending on your perspective, the lighthouse may look different to different characters. It may appear large or small, short or tall. It may be dark and musty or bright and clear. Perspective is defined by Random House. Random House Dictionary as a broad view of events or ideas in their true nature and relationships. Virginia Woolf in To the Lighthouse takes an insightful journey into the true nature of relationships through the perspective of many different characters. Many times throughout the novel, especially in the first part, it is difficult to decipher who Woolf is speaking through, where you can find the writer, where is she positioning, whose perspective she is taking. But as the novel unfolds, it becomes clear that there really is only one reality. The reader may see at once the opposing yet relative perceptions made between life, love, marriage and death in Woolf's novel. In this novel, Woolf seems to capture perfectly the very essence of life while conveying life's significance as communicated to the reader in light tones of consciousness, arranged with the play of visual imagery. That is, each character in the novel plays an intrinsic role in that the individuality of other characters can be seen only through the former's psyche. Moreover, every aspect of this novel plays a significant role in its creation. So, for instance, the saturation of the present by the past, the atmospheres conjoining personalities and separating them, and the moments when things come together and fall apart. We are to explore such aspects of To the Lighthouse while incorporating the notion that the world Woolf creates in this novel is one that combines finite and infinite truth. A created world that recognizes both limitation and isolation, and how these themes are interrelated in and throughout the marriage of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay. So conceptually, Woolf combines all of the aforementioned realities of life into the presentation of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay's married couple that seem to stand for both accurate and visionary approaches to the reality of, or I say, realities of life. It is important then to consider that To the Lighthouse is not only representation of life, but that is also catches life. It is thus the goal of this description to readily show why this is so. So in the novel, this theme of marriage is a fundamental one. The actual meaning of this marriage, however, receives different clarifications and different perspectives from people. In a book by Ellis, when, for example, an interpretation of the Ramsay's marriage by Herbert Murder is considered, Herbert feels that Regina viewed marriage from two essentially different points of view, describing it in an intensely critical spirit as a patriarchal institution, but also expressing a visionary ideal of marriage as the ultimate relation. So this quotation seems to illustrate both the strife and harmony of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay's relationship to one another. One could further suggest that the Ramsay's marriage represents an ideal balance between seemingly conflicted truths. This observation of opposing truths is depicted in both characters. At the beginning of the novel, for instance, Mr. Ramsay is portrayed as a man who is always truthful. What he said was true. It was always true. So he was incapable of untruth, never tampered with a fact, never altered a disagreeable word to suit the pleasure or convenience of any mortal being, least of all of his own children. And here we are talking about Mr. Ramsay. This quality that Mr. Ramsay possesses have very positive or negative is juxtaposition basically with that of an opposing quality which is characterized in Mrs. Ramsay. So it's a sharp contrast between both of these characters. But then again, it was the other thing too, not being able to tell him the truth, being afraid, for instance, about the greenhouse roof and the expense it would be. To the Lighthouse then is really a story of a struggle between two kinds of truth, Mr. Ramsay's and Mrs. Ramsay's. For him, truth seems to be concrete, factual. For her, truth seems to be one's endeavor toward truth. To further clarify this claim, here are references to make to a point in a novel in which the reader is able to see just how different Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay perceive life. It is when they are discussing their son Andrew and what he might accomplish in life. Oh, scholarships. She said Mr. Ramsay thought her foolish for saying that about a serious thing like a scholarship. He should be very proud of Andrew if he got a scholarship, he said. She would be just as proud of him if he didn't, she answered. The differing approaches of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, whether perceived as right or wrong, present a choice between the former and the later, which is indeed a matter of preference, of perception in fact. For in this novel, there lies an alternative for the reader, a choice or option that is illustrative of life and their approach to life. So we now shift focus back to Mr. Ramsay to further emphasize just how his concept of truth correlates with that of Mrs. Ramsay in relation to reality. To begin, it is necessary to question why exactly does Mr. Ramsay insist upon imposing on his family and all the while in doing so combats with himself. From Mr. Ramsay's perspective, the answer seems to be objective. The statement proves true when Lily Briscoe offers to the reader some insight into his claim. Whenever she thought of his work, she always saw clearly before her a large kitchen table. It was Andrew's doing. She asked him what his father's books were about, subject and object and the nature of reality. Andrew had said. And when she said heavens, she had no notion what that meant. Think of a kitchen table then. He told her, when you are not there. One may consider this quotation as evidence of the belief Mr. Ramsay holds about truth. It seems as though he's constructed a concrete, factual reality, a reality that almost discards the notion of beauty. Furthermore, Lily also sees that Mr. Ramsay is almost larger than life in his dedication to unveil the truth. She sees him almost as a machine that processes rather than appreciates. Naturally, if one's days were passed in the seeing of angular essence, this reducing of lovely evenings with all their flamingo clouds in blue and silver to a white deal four-legged table, and it was a mark of the finest mind so to do. Naturally, one could not be judged like an ordinary person. That's a reference from the text. In reading this, it may seem easy for one to claim that Mr. Ramsay is missing something in his life, but although he bravely grasps at the truth that he so uncompromisingly perceives, for this his character must be ascribed as Alice when Bronckley comments that, like the body of the lighthouse, then Mr. Ramsay stands fascinating or fancying the limitations, the fact of isolation in his life, basically. Without being able to accept a truth which is based upon unity and boundlessness, without, in other words, sensing the vision, he provides the firm foundation that lies at the core of what vision, the fact that must perceived as solid before it can take on transcendence. Thus, Mr. Ramsay's attitude and perceptions of life and truth play an intrinsic role into the lighthouse. For he is a man who maintains great character. He has substance. He also has Mrs. Ramsay. Who is Mrs. Ramsay? She is indeed a character that can be defined in many different ways, which has been done so by many different critics. However, here she may be defined above all as a wife and mother. She has 8 children and enjoys playing a maternal role for all those who surround her. She is also a character who seems to altogether over her world, providing order and unity throughout her life, and even after her death. She is almost eternal, and her perceptions of truth in relation to life differs greatly from that perceived by Mrs. Ramsay or Mr. Ramsay. The combination of basically opposing attitudes toward life is what makes this novel work and interest its reader more. It is also what makes Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay work together. Again, their perceptions of truth differ, a statement that may be exemplified in many passages throughout the novel. However, among all the differences in Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay's attitude toward truth, there is one passage that defines Mrs. Ramsay's character and what truth really means to her. It is a passage that demonstrates Mrs. Ramsay's concern for her son James not being able to go to the lighthouse. It also allows the reader to get a sense for who Mrs. Ramsay really is. In a moment he would ask her, "Are we going to the lighthouse?" And she would have to say, "No, not tomorrow." Your father says, "Not." Happily, Mildred came in to fetch them, and the bustle distracted them. Well, but he kept looking back over his shoulder as Mildred carried him out, and she was certain that he was thinking, "We are not going to the lighthouse tomorrow," and she thought he will remember that all his life. However, it is necessary in nothing that Mrs. Ramsay must not be depicted as a dreamer of sorts. She can indeed be overbearing, almost trifling, but she is not a woman who is able to wander through a dream world from which the nastiness of life is ignored. She is most definitely aware, except her approach to life simply differs from her husband's, which in turn is necessary for the novel, not the story, to progress. Moreover, in a very perspective commentary on To the Lighthouse, John Graham captures the full significance of the Ramsay's marriage, stating clearly everything that I have been building towards in the analysis. Crudely put, Mrs. Ramsay equals eternity. Mr. Ramsay equals time. They are married. For Mrs. Ramsay, though, she triumphs in time, triumphs because she intuits eternity, and Mr. Ramsay, though he loftily seeks a philosophical absolute which will solve the problem of subject and object and the nature of reality, cannot break his bondage to time without the aid of his wife. Together they fulfill each other and are the creators of life. That is the basic pure pleasure provided by Virginia Woolf in this novel. They think nothing alike, yet they need each other nonetheless. Therefore, Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay are deeply interdependent. Without one, it seems as though the other would not exist, nor would there exist an all-encompassing journey of transcendence to the lighthouse. So, in summation, the substance of To the Lighthouse is provided directly by life. It catches life in a fashion that I have yet to see in any other novel. I enjoyed this book very much, in fact. However, I recognize reasons for people's not liking it too much. It is undeniable that To the Lighthouse lacks progressive action, and that involves moral choices and decisions. And this was particularly my point of view regarding my liking of this writing. Now, let's see, how do you find it? The novel must tell a story. Although who needs a story when an author perfectly captures a concept such as the world of mind-time and the world of linear time and their relation to each other? For both are related to an inner and ceaseless reality. So this is the essence of the novel basically, and the essence of the technique applied by Virginia Woolf. Although I planned a comparison between James Joyce and Virginia Woolf in this lecture, however, this discussion has taken a bit longer and I won't be able to provide this, but I am planning this to be in any of my following lecture, probably in next 3 to 4 lectures somewhere where I find a space, I would like to bring in this comparison between James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. However, for today's, what we could cover so far, we had a critical discourse analysis of several questions that can be asked on different lines on this novel. We discussed important quotations, and we also discussed a critique on the novel by Virginia Woolf, and that makes us finish this novel today. So, I see you in the next lecture, in lecture 13 inshallah. For today, Allah Hafiz.